Okay, it's already started. So yeah, everybody agrees now with that. Okay, I see no reaction, so it's yes. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this last webinar of this regional training on microplastics organized under the WES project. So I will give you a few recap about the last webinar that we organized, so that you can see the articulation with this third one. Then I will make an introduction on while we zoom. I have been muted. Yeah. So I will zoom out and give you some information on how things are moving also at the global level, because there are a lot of it's moving very fast and hopefully in the good direction. And then we will see a bit the agenda for today. So during the last webinar, that the second module of this regional training that was organized on the 24th of May, we focused mainly on primary microplastics. So namely on the microplastic that were intentionally added in like in cosmetic, detergent, paint. And we also received some information on the issue created by unintentionally released microplastics like pellet, flakes, and powder. So we could have also some view intervention from different kinds of stakeholders, like NGO expert in the topic, but also it was also very interesting to get some views from the industry and how they were also acting, and how they were seeing also the next regulation regarding microplastics, in particular at the EU level. And for today, we will focus mainly on the secondary microplastics. So secondary microplastic, you will hear more in a moment about this, but they are the ones that are resulted from the fragmentation of larger plastics. So that are already released into the environment, and they go through a process of fragmentation that end into microplastics. And we will also deep dive into two sectors, so microplastics from tires and textile, because they are very important sources of secondary microplastics. So we'll try to have some information about the estimation of amounts, the different measures that are taken to deal with this very complex issue, I must say, and we'll have also views on and position from different stakeholders. Now, just as an introduction, Pedro, if you can go to the next slide. So just to mention that, years ago, the whole story about the plastic pollution started from the marine environment. So at the beginning, and especially at the global level, there was a process, in particular under the United Nations Environment Assembly, they decided to create an ad hoc open-ended working group that was dealing with marine litter and microplastics. So it was always very clear in the title that they were also dealing with microplastics. So they were really focusing on the marine environment with marine experts, and slowly the discussion went now to say that it was not only a marine litter problem, but there was a need to address the full value chain of plastic, and in particular to really tackle the issue at the very beginning of the value chain, namely on the production and also on the eco design, and trying to agree of like global standards, because this is really a global issue. We can find plastics in every single, even remote place of the planet. So there is really a need to address this issue at the global level. So that's what happened a few months ago. Pedro, next slide. at the UNEA 5, where there was a very historic agreement regarding, well, with a resolution for the definition of an internationally legally binding instrument to end plastic pollution. And in the resolution, it's clearly mentioned that, well, microplastics are also part of this plastic pollution. They will be addressed as well. So the process has started now. There was a meeting two weeks ago, more to of the the ad hoc open-ended working group in order to define rather the structure for the negotiation, the rules of procedures, now they have, well, 3 years to come to an agreement to negotiate this new instrument that will cover, as I said, the full life cycle of plastics. Because there were a lot of discussions during the preparation of this decision. Some stakeholders were saying, okay, we already have a lot of multilateral environment agreements. We have Basel Convention, Stockholm Convention, we have Regional CIS Convention, but it was not enough. No, really this agreement, the idea is to really address the full life cycle of plastic. So maybe Pedro, you can go to next slide now. And here you can see a bit the timeline. So there are a lot of meetings, 2 meetings per year in order to reach at the end of 2024 with an ambitious, hopefully an ambitious proposal for this this agreement. The process has been designed to be very open, to involve all stakeholders, and for example, waste speakers are already part of the discussion. And yeah, I wanted to mention that because indeed microplastics are also integrated. So yeah, let's see if we can well have this level of ambition at the global level that will then impact the national level. And in this agreement, there will be also a lot of focus on the production and consumption side. So I will maybe stop here for now. Maybe, yeah, next slide. We can now dive into the agenda for today. So we'll have introduction by Pedro on the specific measures taken on secondary microplastic, in particular also in the framework of the Barcelona Convention. Then we'll have an example on how this is addressed at the national level, with recorded intervention from Marta Martinez-Gil from the Ministry of Environment of Spain. Then we'll have an external expert of MedWaves, Lucy Eggleston, that will deep dive into the tires sector. We'll see we'll see how it the state of the art regarding this sector that is an important source of microplastics, secondary microplastics. Then we will move into the textile sector with an intervention from Lars Mortensen from the European Environment Agency. And finally, we'll have a time for interaction with you with Q&A and discussion. And finally, we'll do the wrap up and closing evaluation of this webinar with Anis Ismail, that is an environmental expert of WES. So I will stop here and I will give the floor to Pedro from MedWaves that will introduce you the topic. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Magali, and welcome everyone. This is our last module of this training on microplastics, and I hope you are enjoying it. We will hear from you at the end what you learned and what you found most interesting in these modules. I would also like to thank the external speakers that we have today, our guests, for their availability, and you will hear from them. They are really knowledgeable on this topic, so I really thanks for being here. In my presentation, I will be focusing on secondary microplastics. So those are the ones that come from the fragmentation of large plastics that they are already in the environment. So here, this could be like a very, let's say, a strict definition of secondary microplastics. So they are the small pieces of plastic derived from the breakdown of larger plastic debris, whether it is at sea or in the land or even in the rivers. It can be in other environmental compartments. So what is very important is to consider that they are already released in the environment as a big plastic item. Let's say, for example, you can see a plastic bottle here in the sea, and eventually with time, it will fragment into smaller pieces and it will degrade. I would say very often, we call also secondary microplastics other kind of microplastics that they end up in the environment, but already as microplastic. And here the difference might be not so clear. And often, for example, Magali was speaking about secondary microplastics for textiles. Here it depends on the report and the authors. Some consider them, like, for example, textile fibers as secondary microplastics, but the thing is that they already get into the environment as microplastic. And that's why sometimes they are considered as primary microplastic, that is an intentional release to the environment. So here it will go in the washing machine, and then from the washing machine, it will go to the wastewater, and it will get into the sea already as a microplastic. So that's the difference with the what is considered more secondary microplastic. Let's hear also from Lucy and Lars whether they have another kind of definition for that, but this is my understanding on the difference between the two kinds. Now, as for the order of magnitude, in this report from IUCN, primary microplastics in the oceans, you have here the link, and I think it's going to be shared in the chat. It was estimated that between 15 and 31% of all plastic in oceans would originate from primary sources. And primary sources we would consider microplastics in cosmetics, pellet loss, tire abrasion, paints, and so on. So all sources of primary microplastics. That could mean that between 69 and 85% of microplastics in the ocean are secondary microplastics. So they would come from the fragmentation of large plastic items. So you can see the importance of this source of microplastics. And in the end, it comes to the issue of general plastic waste into the environment, that eventually it will become microplastic. As for the sources and pathway of secondary microplastics, you can see this diagram. It's a lot of information, but here we will get back into the main sources of marine litter or plastic waste. And those you have generally the differentiation between land-based sources and the sea-based sources. I won't get into the details, but we know it's about leakage from household waste through the sewage system in the cities, about tourism and recreation, agriculture, etc. And then sea-based sources, fisheries and aquaculture, shipping, and so on. Here, of course, it depends a lot on the location. You might have more leakage from one source than another, but generally it would relate to all kinds of sources of plastic waste into the environment. Now, as for the fragmentation and the degradation process of plastic in the environment, that, as I said, it happens in all environmental compartments. So it can be in land, it can be in lakes, it can be in rivers, and so on. And it will degrade in a different way depending on the agents that they are provoking this fragmentation and degradation. Here you can see, for example, in the sea, when we have a floating plastic item, due to the UV degradation, so the sunlight, it will start degrading. And also the mechanical force of the sea, it will also provoke fragmentation and deterioration. So it will be becoming smaller particles of plastic. It will become eventually nanoplastics, so that will be below 1 millimeter and even below to the micro, let's say. And in the end, it should be a biodegradation. And here, the matter is how long it takes to biodegrade. And also it will be much more difficult to biodegrade when it's already sunk into the sediment rather than when it's more exposed to environmental agents. So we have all these kind of degradation processes happening due to the heat, due to the sunlight, due to the oxygen, due to the mechanical stress, and so on. So this is more like the physics and chemistry of plastics. Now, here in this webinar, we are focusing on the prevention measures. So in the end, this is what we want to achieve to prevent the plastic leakage and plastic pollution. If we speak about prevention measures on secondary microplastics, we will have to go back to the prevention of macroplastic waste in all the sources and pathways, because in the end, they are all originating these secondary microplastics. For that, in the Mediterranean context, we have the framework of the Union for the Mediterranean with the 2030 Greener Med agenda. And we also have the framework of the Barcelona Convention. Here, I already explained in the previous webinar, like latest developments in these frameworks. In the case of the Barcelona Convention, a milestone was in the COP22 last December, and it was the upgrade of the regional plan on marine litter. So this addresses all sources. Now it has a very, with the upgrade, a lot of stress was put on single-use plastics, circular economy, and this kind of new development, let's say, on the, to address plastic waste. But it also addresses sea-based sources like shipping, derelict fishing gear, and all these kind of sources. So it's like a very comprehensive framework to address marine litter. In support of the implementation of this regional plan, MedWaves also developed the regional guidelines to phase out single-use plastic items, and that's very specific, as the title says, on single-use plastic items. And I will show you some slides just as a, let's say, a reminder, because we already addressed this kind of topic in other webinars, and most of you were already present in a previous training, so I don't want to repeat myself. So here you have the link for the guidelines. It's also available in French. And here what we did together with the southern countries, the ones participating in the other WES training, was to come up with a list of priority single-use plastic items to be addressed in priority in the Mediterranean. This list, well, it was consulted with the countries, but it comes from the plastic litter that it was that is most frequent found on beaches or in the sea. And this comes from the monitoring program that is being coordinated by the colleagues of MedPol in UNEP-MAP and with the reporting from the countries. So here we would have bags, cigarette filters, drink bottles, crisp packets and sweet wrappers, then items from the on-the-go food and beverage packaging, and that could comprise cutlery, straws, drink cups, and so on, sanitary applications that they are flushed down the toilet. And we also included personal protective equipment, because back then it was exactly during the pandemic of COVID-19, and it was decided to include these kind of items to be addressed in priority, and also noting that this list is not to be understood as something static. It may happen in the future that it might be other items that they could be intensively used in the Mediterranean, and hence it could be subject of public concern. And there might be some others that maybe in the case there are important policy measures addressing this kind of items, it might happen that they are not a problem anymore. That could be our wish, I guess. Then in the guidelines, we also approach the feasibility of this measure in the Mediterranean context. I'm not going to explain all kind of measures that can be applied to this single-use plastic, but you can guess already. It's information campaigns, mandatory labeling, extended producer responsibility, bans, consumption levies, and so on. And of course, depending on the item, some of the measures, they could be more adequate and more effective than others. So there is this kind of information that you can consult. And as I mentioned, in preparing this guideline, we also organized together with the WES team a regional training on single-use plastics, like the one on microplastics, but this was specific on single-use plastics, and you have the link to all the content in that training. It was 4 webinars. We started with the introduction on the problem of single-use plastics, then the responses, and here we had the policy measures and the alternatives. Then something very specific on the feasibility and impact of measures, and for that we use 4 case studies, 4 countries, where we analyzed the the impact that this kind of measure would have in terms of environmental benefits and also socioeconomic effects. And the last webinar was about the implementation of the measures. So it was about these regional guidelines, but also some other additional measures that they could support the implementation, for example, of a ban. It's not just about adopting a policy measure, but also everything you do or everything you should do around it for a smooth implementation. So with that, I will stop here. I thank you for your attention. We will have time for questions and comments. But if you like, we can go to the next presentation. That will be, as Magali said, it's a recorded presentation from the Ministry of Spain. And here, let me just share the sound of the computer so you can hear the, okay, it's already activated. So it should work. Okay, so there we go. So welcome, Marta Martinez Gil. I recorded this video yesterday with her. She was very sorry she couldn't be today with us, but in the end we found this this solution. Like, let's record it, because she was very willing to participate in this training. So I leave you with her.
Good morning, my name is Marta Martinez Gil and I work for the Spanish Ministry of the Environment and specifically in the Marine Protection Unit. I'm the Assistant Deputy Director of this unit, and I've been asked to talk to you about the experience of Spain addressing microplastics, and specifically I'm going to address the issue of the Spanish marine strategies, where we are really addressing all the marine protection. Firstly, we will set the scene very shortly. We will introduce microplastics and their impacts very shortly, because you're already learning a lot about this in other talks. And after that, I will introduce these marine strategies and how we are addressing the monitoring of microplastics and the measures on microplastics within these strategies. So first of all, we need to say what we are talking about. These microplastics are considered a group of synthetic materials made from petroleum derivatives and bio-based polymers, and they are solid, size below 5 millimeters, and not soluble in water, and with a low degradability, which creates problems. We can talk about primary and secondary microplastics, as you may already know. When we talk about these primary ones, are the intentionally added microplastics in products. So, for example, the industrial abrasives or cosmetics that use these small particles. And we also talk about primary ones when we are addressing the pre-production plastic pellets, which are essential for the plastic industry. Normally, the intentionally produced ones are not so essential. And then we have the secondary ones that results from the degradation of larger plastic fragments already in the environment. So you have here this nice picture where you can see that when we are consuming, for example, a toothpaste, we may have intentionally added microplastics in there. So when we use it, this product are finalized through the sink into the water, and it could end up in the environment somehow. And then we also have the recipient that if it ends up also in the environment, it could cause the secondary degradation of the recipient. So we have both types of microplastics in this good example. And we have also the fact that we are consuming marine resources. So we end up in a circle, as you see. So the microplastics have been detected in 80% of the oceanic surface and are persistent in the environment. They are entering the marine food chain and they accumulate in the seafloor. They are increasingly present almost everywhere in the oceans, including the polar ice cap, but also the continental waters and the terrestrial environment. They are ingested by numerous species, and there are areas of high concentration of microplastics that coincide with feeding areas of aquatic organisms. There is also an interesting piece of information from the scientific reports that talk about plastisphere, which is this new ecosystem created around the plastic as a substrate. So microbial communities that develop on the surface of plastics are becoming this new ecosystem, and this is being studied. And the identification of quantification of microplastics requires standardized techniques and methodologies. And this is also being developed at the international level. And finally, the modeling is a very interesting tool to identify sources, pathways, and potential sinks of microplastics. So you see these microplastics are consumed by a wide range of marine species, and they can absorb these persistent bioaccumulative and toxic compounds that may be in the environment. So these toxic concentrates around the surface of the plastic. And also plastics themselves have additives that may be also toxic in some cases. So in the end, we have this pathway of concentrated toxic chemicals that are introduced through plastics into the marine organisms. And this has created demonstrated impacts at the level of individuals, reduction of fertility or increasing of mortality, and also at the level of ecosystems are being studied. And in the end, of course, there is this risk of transfer into humans through the commercial species. So how are we addressing these? We have this tool, which is called Marine Strategies, that is following the ecosystem approach that you may already know, because it is exactly the same as Barcelona Convention is following in the CAP process. So the issue is to obtain a balance between the pressure of human activities and the conservation of nature, as well as the sustainable use of goods and ecosystem services by current and future generations. And this is done through the following of 11 descriptors. One of them is the marine litter, and this is the one where we are going to focus today. As you know, microplastics are a part of what is called marine litter. So the marine strategies need some assessment that are done each 6 years. The first one, we did it in 2012, and then we updated it in 2018 with more information. Then we need to define what we understand as a good environmental status, and this was done firstly in 2012 and then again reviewed 6 years afterwards. And then we have these environmental objectives that are going to be our inspiration for the measures. And the first ones were approved in 2012 again, but we reviewed them and agreed them by Council of Ministers in June 2019. Then we developed our first program of measures in 2014. We updated it in 2020. And then the program of measures, our first one was between 2015 and 2021, and now we are about to publish the second program of measures. And the measures are published also by royal decree. So this gives quite a strength commitment in which regards to compliance of those measures. Okay, so how are we monitoring microplastics? We have this microplastics on beaches monitoring program, which I'm going to talk about today. That includes a number of 14 beaches that are monitored twice per year, in autumn and in spring. And this started in 2016. The program is developed by our agency, which is called FedEx, including the service and the laboratory analysis. So the sampling at the beach needs 5 replicates per beach that coincides with the 100-meter stretch of the beach microliter monitoring program, which is an independent one. And then the sample is the top 1 centimeter layer within the 50 per 50 centimeters quadrat. And we discarded any processing or separation of samples at field because it was really created a lot of difficulties. So we take the sample and we take it to the laboratory to be processed and analyzed. So what are we doing in the laboratory? We dry the sample, we homogenize and weight it. And after that we sieve by 5 millimeters and 1 millimeter aperture size to end up with 2 subsamples. So the biggest one, between 1 and 5 millimeters, needs only 1 extraction after this flotation separation process and filtration afterwards. And the smallest one, which is below 1 millimeter, it also follows the flotation separation process, but it needs 3 extraction and the filtration. And then each membrane is transferred into a Petri dish and dried at 50 degrees. And then we can use the microscope to do the inspection, where particles are counted and classified by size, type, color, and so on. If you see the results from 2016 until now, we can see that almost half of the microparticles that are found on beaches are fragments. So we are talking about these secondary microplastics that are really very difficult to deal with. We need just to finalize with the plastic leakage in the ocean to avoid this, because to avoid fragmentation afterwards is just impossible. So we have to go to the source to address the problem. And then we have these pellets, which is the green part of the chart, where you see that there are some beaches where these are found in great amounts. They are not found everywhere, but we have found some beaches where the pellets are very relevant. And in 2 beaches, which are called Pineda and Lambra, one in Canary Islands and one in Catalonia, these species are found in huge amounts. So we are now trying to study the sources of those in 2 separate case studies. And the orange part of this chart is the polyestyrene, the expanded polyestyrene, which also comes from degradation of bigger pieces of plastic. So those case studies are radically different. The one in Canary Island, in Lambra Beach, is receiving transboundary pollution that comes from the Atlantic through the Mexico current. And the plastic is very degraded. And then the Pineda Beach, which is in Catalonia, we are finding very new pellets that are not degraded at all. So they are coming from very near source. And we see that the 70% of plastic producers in Spain are concentrated in this area, and also the 30% of manufacturers. So what we already know is that the plastic industry is losing pellets in the producing, transporting, and manufacturing process. So we need to address this to see where these pellets are lost and address the specific measures. So in our program of measures 2022-2027, we are inspiring ourselves in this new environmental target approved by ministers, which is to reduce the amount of microplastics reaching the marine environment. And the indicators that we are going to use are the abundance of microplastics on beaches. So this monitoring program I've just talked about will be essential to assess effectiveness, to assess the compliance of this objective. And then also the number of measures implemented by industrial sectors to reduce the impact of microplastics. And this is important because we think that the industry has a very relevant role in their own processes to avoid the intentionally added microplastics, to use alternative materials, and in the end to make an effort to complement other efforts from other stakeholders. And then the number of retention measures implemented, and here we are talking about, for example, the use of these filters in the washing machines that can retain these fibers entering the watercourse. Okay, so which are the priority work streams on microplastics that we intend to develop in the next 6 years? First of all, we are going to strengthen or develop further the identification of specific sources of pellets pollution in the area of La Pineda Beach and the river basin upstream. Then we need to identify measures to address microplastics from tires abrasion and textiles, which are two types of microplastics that have been identified as very relevant sources. We also need to develop actions in support of Operation Clean Sweep initiative. This is an initiative, a voluntary initiative from the sector, trying to achieve this zero pellet loss, which is really relevant. So we are going to exhaustively follow up the implementation in Spain of this voluntary initiative and its effectiveness to see if this is enough. We are collaborating in actions promoted by industry to accelerate the OCS adhesion and certification by industry, which is really relevant along the whole value chain. In Spain, there is also a certification for this scheme warranting that the company is doing things correctly. And this has started in 2020, and I think it's the first country in Europe applying this certification scheme. And for this reason, the government has been, well, the Spanish Ministry of Environment has been invited to be a member of the supervisory board of the certification at the European level. And of course, we need to improve knowledge and to be very updated. So through the National Research Council and the University of Cádiz, we are going to strengthen the policy science interface, incorporating these scientific products into a policy. And in the end, we are expecting a very relevant regulation coming from the European Union, which is called the REACH regulation. I think that somebody from the European Commission is also going to talk about this in this webinar, and these are very relevant measures that are going to address the intentionally added microplastics. There's going to be some restrictions and also some requirements for those microplastics that are essential. For example, the plastic pellets, they are going to be asked for reporting losses and also for labeling. So I think this package is going to be absolutely crucial also to achieve the environmental objective. And I think this is all from my side. So it's been a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you very much. Good morning. My name.
Well, so thank you, Marta. Okay, so I don't know whether maybe we can take some moment for questions or comment if you like. I think we are doing fine with time, so we can have a little break with questions and comments, and then we can move forward with the next speaker. So if anyone wants to share some thought or any question, comment, that's very welcome. Otherwise, we can wait until the end and we can open that space. Okay, so I just see some thanks. So then, yeah, let's move forward. We have still two very important presentations. So I would like to give the floor to Lucy Eggleston, acting today as external expert for MedWaves, and she will be introducing the unintentional release of microplastics, and she will be focusing on tire abrasion. So Lucy, whenever you are ready.
Thanks very much, Pedro. I will just share my screen. Hopefully that has worked for you.
Yeah, it's working.
Great. So hi, everyone. My name is Lucy Eggleston. I'm a senior consultant at environmental consultancy Eunomia Research and Consulting, and I lead a lot of our transport-related work, so looking at tyres and other emissions associated with transport. First of all, I'd like to say a big thank you to the MedWaves team for inviting me to speak to you all today. I hope you've been enjoying your sessions thus far. It looks like it's been a great program, and I'm really glad to be able to hopefully provide you with a bit of insight into some further detail on one very specific area of microplastics. As mentioned previously, and as you can hopefully see on my screen, today I'm going to be speaking to you about unintentionally released primary microplastics from tyre wear. So we've already heard some really great definitions for microplastics, primary and secondary microplastics from Pedro and Marta. So thank you to them for setting the scene and providing some helpful background information. I'm going to build on their presentations and would like to start here with what you can see on the screen. This is the title of the 2018 Eunomia study and is kind of the basis from which we're starting for this presentation. As can be seen from the title, which is investigating options for reducing releases in the aquatic environment of microplastics emitted by products. The focus in this instance was really on aquatic environments, so marine, rivers, lakes, all of those sorts of environments. And historically, this has been the key argument behind the need to address unintentionally released microplastics. You will, I think, probably have seen this slide when my colleague Chris presented last week. It provides an overview of the pathways for microplastic releases to surface water specifically. And as you can see, microplastics released as a result of tyre wear is significant, potentially the largest single source. But you can see here the range represents the uncertainty we have regarding the data. I'd like to just spend a second highlighting the differences in our knowledge surrounding plastic pellets and microplastics from plastic pellets and microplastics from tyre wear. In Marta's presentation, you heard a little bit about plastic pellets specifically, and she hinted about what we kind of know about where they come from and what volumes they come in and where they end up. But I think it's really important to understand how this differs to tyres to kind of set the scene. So with plastic pellets, there really tends to be little or no data regarding the volumes of material, like the pellets, that are lost at source. But we do know that they get to the marine environment in most simple terms because they're visible. You can find them on the beach. You don't really know how much is lost, material is lost, but you know that they're in the marine environment. But for tyres, it's almost the complete opposite. We know how much plastic is lost from tyres because we know how regularly we have to replace them. We know we can measure how much mass they lose. We can measure the tyre wear. But there is considerable uncertainty surrounding where that tyre wear particulate matter then goes. It's difficult to know whether they reach the marine environment or what volumes they reach the marine environment in, as most simply, they're really difficult to detect. Physically, they're just more difficult to see. They're small, they're black, and they don't really contrast well with the marine environment, the typical marine environment. In contrast to that, pellets tend to be larger in size. They can be really brightly coloured and more visual. So I think that's just a really key difference to highlight between the two forms of microplastic that we see as being kind of the largest contributors to microplastic release to surface wear specifically. As has been mentioned a couple of times by myself and others as well, much of the discussion surrounding tyre wear has been driven historically by the issues in the marine environment. However, there are loads of other arguments for tackling tyre wear, even if you completely disregard aquatic environments. So in this presentation, I'll be looking to explore a few of these arguments in a little bit more detail, and also highlight some of the potential policy measures that could be put in place to begin to address them. I believe you'll also have seen this diagram during my colleague Chris's recent presentation, but just to highlight it once again, this shows the estimated generation of microplastics at source for the different products that were investigated during the study. As you can see, it really clearly demonstrates that tyres, road markings, pre-production plastic pellets, and also the washing of synthetic clothing are really large sources of microplastic emissions in the environment. You can also see that soil, which is represented in orange on the graph, is the largest overall sink and is largely comprised of microplastics that are washed or blown from roads. These can, we say they end up in soil, but these can also, it's worth noting, over time be washed into waterways as well. So now that we've kind of set the scene a little bit, I want to spend just a minute or so discussing vehicle emissions specifically. Vehicles generate numerous sources of emissions during use, and I've labelled a few of them here on the diagram. One of the most talked about sources of emissions is exhaust emissions, which produces carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, hydrocarbons, nitrous oxides, particulate matter, etc. But there are loads of others that tend to get or have historically received a little less attention. Noise pollution is a really important emission, but not one that's of particular relevance to this presentation. So I'm going to kind of graze over that. And refueling losses and evaporative emissions are largely dominated by hydrocarbons and volatile organic compounds. So again, not particularly relevant for our discussion today. However, there is the abrasion of tyres, brakes and clutches, and also road surface wear and resuspension of road dust, which create really large volumes of particulate matter. Of these, the largest single contributor is to unintentionally released microplastics is tyre wear. So as you know, that's going to be the focus of the presentation. But how do tyres actually generate microplastics? Well, tyres wear during use, and this produces microparticles. The wear happens when the rubber tyres abrade against the rough surfaces of roads and other surfaces. These microparticles then combine with others from asphalt, clutch wear, brake wear, and road particles to create something that's known as road dust. These particles then become airborne and are resuspended when they are disturbed by movement such as more cars, walking, cycling, things like that. And they then collect in verges and in stormwater runoff and then enter the environment. I want to just point out quickly that some level of tyre wear is needed for vehicle safety. The occurrence of wear is indicative of tyres gripping the road surface, so it's really important for safe cornering, accelerating and braking in vehicles. The rate at which tyres actually wear is dependent on a number of different factors related to what the tyres are made of, how they're manufactured, how well they're maintained. So that includes things like how often you check how inflated they are and maintain their tyre pressure, and also driving style. So if you are a more aggressive driver, stop-start, taking corners quite quickly, then your tyres are likely to wear at an accelerated rate versus someone who is a little bit more cautious. What is worth noting, though, is that as we understand it, the level that tyres currently wear is likely greater than is needed to ensure that level of grip and that level of safety. So you could say that the volume of microplastic particles released into the environment is excessive. And so we need to take steps to limit this, to reduce it, as well as then to tackle the microplastics that do need to be released for safe use of vehicles. In terms of the scale of the problem, the global tyre microplastic emissions are estimated to be approximately 0.81 kilos per year per person, which in itself perhaps doesn't sound like too much, although if you kind of try and visualize that, perhaps that is quite a lot of microplastics from tyres alone. But when you add that up at a global scale, you get an annual total of 6.16 million tons of microplastic emissions globally, which is huge. The one of the issues related to these microplastic emissions is that they aren't simply localized. It isn't just around roads that you find these microplastics from tires. Because they get dispersed into watercourses and soils, but also because they are small and get dispersed over airstreams, microplastics have been found to travel up to 95 kilometers. They've been found in remote places like the Pyrenees, the Alps, even the Arctic as well, which, as you can imagine, has the potential to cause some serious issues that we'll go into in the next couple of slides. So it's worth noting that this significant health threat to both the environment and public health isn't just localized, it is a global threat. On the right-hand side of this screen, I've extracted the tyre-specific data from our 2018 report. So the second graph I showed you earlier on, this is the data related to just the tyres. I wanted to discuss it in a little bit more detail with you. So you can see here that the purple section, which represents the soil, is the largest sink for microplastics from tyre wear. However, as has been previously mentioned, much of the historic arguments actually surround combating unintentionally released microplastics in waterways and other aquatic environments. It is likely that some of these microplastics that do make their way into the soil then make their way into waterways through rainwater runoff, etc. as well. But touching on the impacts specific to waterways, as has been previously mentioned, the argument for addressing microplastics historically focuses on this area, and this does remain relevant for tyres as well as other applications such as clothing, etc. And in fact, the negative impacts of microplastics on aquatic life that is specific to tyre wear have been explored in a number of different studies over the past few years. So you can see here I've pulled out 4 of the ones that are perhaps most commonly referred to or are particularly damaging. So the deposition of tyre particulate matter in waterways reduces feeding rates in fish. It reduces ocean biodiversity. It's also been implicated in killing oxygen-producing phytoplankton. And finally, one here that's a little less well known is that some of the chemicals in tyres are toxic to certain species. So 6-PPD, which is a chemical in tyres, has been proven toxic to spawning salmon. Some study looking at coho salmon over in the States have found that the presence of this chemical in their waters has drastically reduced the number of salmon within their rivers. So that's the impact in waterways. But as I previously mentioned, there are other arguments for tackling tyre wear, even if we completely ignore the impacts related to aquatic life. So looking specifically at land for one, and it is worth noting that existing research on the ecological impacts of tyre particulate matter in land-based ecosystems is far less developed than in marine environments. But as I referred to earlier, we know that these particles are reaching land-based ecosystems where they really shouldn't be. So we talked about the French Pyrenees and the Alps, and here's a couple of relatively recent news articles looking at tyre particles found in the Arctic specifically. And the reason I've highlighted these 3 geographical locations is because the extent of their impact is potentially really significant. So when tyre microplastics are found in snow and ice-covered areas, they change the albedo of the ground. And so that's an expression of the ability of a surface to reflect sunlight specifically. So white snow or ice tends to reflect the sunlight. However, when it's dispersed with tiny black microparticles, those black microparticles absorb the sunlight instead. That lowers the albedo of the ground, and therefore exacerbating ice melt, which, as I'm sure are all very aware, can have really serious negative impacts on other areas of the environment. So melting sea ice can cause sea levels to rise, increase sea temperatures, and all of these impacts can increase the frequency of extreme weather events, for example, and that's particularly important for island and coastal nations. But considering a more recent addition to the argument for tackling tyre wear particulate matter is air quality. So the introduction, there is a lot of discussion in recent times about air quality, and consumers, governments, organisations, they're all becoming more aware of the impact of air quality. This is shown through the introduction of things like clean air zones and other interventions that have really raised the profile of the concern. But previously, much of the discussion related to air quality in vehicles has been specific to exhaust emissions, but we found that actually almost 2,000 times more particle pollution is produced by tyre wear than exhaust emissions in modern cars. And that's part of that is to do with the fact that modern cars have interventions within them that minimize or reduce their emissions from exhausts, but it also just highlights the scale of the problem to do with the tyres and the fact that there are interventions. We need interventions now. The reason that tyre particles can be so detrimental to air quality is that they are very, very small in size. So particulate matter is generally split into size classifications, and the two most common of which for tyres are PM2.5 and PM10. And that refers to particles that are less than 2.5 and less than 10 microns in diameter, respectively. And this means, as you can see on the right-hand side, that's smaller than human hair, which means that they can become airborne very easily, particularly when they're disturbed by further driving. So if they're found in road dust on the road and then a car comes through very quickly, that resuspension of the road dust can mean that they can be caught on airstreams and distributed really, really widely. And so the impact of tyre microplastics on air quality is huge. But what does that actually mean for human health, for example? Well, it's generally accepted that up to 10% of tyre wear particles become airborne, but some reports estimate that to be a lot higher, so perhaps up to 30% in some instances. And that increase of particulate matter in the air leads to a reduction in air quality, which by extension negatively impacts human health. I've listed a few of the potential impacts on human health here. So taking first PM2.5. PM2.5 is so small that it can penetrate your lungs, and even has been found to make its way into the bloodstream of humans and animals. This can lead to a reduced lung capacity, reduced respiratory system function, and also an increased likelihood of several diseases such as chronic bronchitis, cardiac arrhythmias, heart attacks, etc., ultimately leading to premature deaths. Exposure to PM10, which are the slightly larger particles, is linked to respiratory and circulatory conditions, neurological diseases, endocrine disruptions, which are things like birth defects and hormonal impacts, and again, premature deaths. There are quite a number of studies, recent studies, that link a decline in air quality with economic impact, and the relationship between the two is quite large. If that's something that's of interest to anyone, please do reach out and I can send you some really interesting papers that go into that in a bit more detail. But what is clear is that the impact of tyre wear is directly related to human health. So we've talked about a number of the impacts on waterways, land and air, and by way of that, human health. But what I would like to talk about now is addressing tyre microplastics, and specifically first from a policy perspective, and then I will touch briefly on from a technology perspective as well. So once again, considering UNOMIA's 2018 microplastic study, within this study, we explored measures to address particulate matter occurring in marine environments, and this included measures specific to tyre wear. This actually remains a topic of interest amongst the Commission, and three of the proposals, the specific proposals that we put forward within this document, are now being taken forward to impact assessment by the Commission. I'll talk about those three and you can see them on the slide here in a second. But first, I just wanted to take a second to touch on other ways of reducing tyre particulate matter creation, and specifically to do with behaviour change. So really the most effective way to reduce microplastics produced from tyres is to reduce the amount we drive, simple as that. So within this study, and also now, I'd just like to stress the fact that there is a need to promote behaviour change campaigns that encourage active travel, such as walking and cycling over driving. And that really is the best way to reduce and limit microplastic creation from tire wear. However, that aside, discussing the measures that are included within our report and those that are being taken forward to the impact assessment, there are three that I'd like to draw your attention to. Before I do that, though, you can see there are, within the brackets in those 3 points, we've got plus test method a couple of times. So for each of these, and even the third as well, but to a lesser degree, there's a prerequisite for the creation of a standard method for measuring tire wear, because currently there's actually no agreed methodology for doing this at all. Some manufacturers do state an abrasion rate for their different products, and perhaps in some instances they're comparable within product ranges. So perhaps Pirelli tires are comparable with one another, but they're not comparable across markets, as each of the different manufacturers use a different methodology for measuring it. They report it in different ways, and it's not clear to consumers or other manufacturers or policymakers how they compare to one another. So taking that into consideration, a standard test method really must come first. That'll enable then the subsequent introduction of all of these policy measures that are designed to directly address the issue. It's also worth noting that the lack of a comparable measurement method also represents a market failure in this instance. We know that consumers want this, but they're currently unable to make informed decisions, purchasing decisions based on tire abrasion rates, because the data is not available to them. This is an issue that we really need to rectify, not just for microplastic creation, but also for consumers as well. But assuming that we can put in place a standard test method, considering the measures themselves, the first one we have is to enforce an emissions limit for abrasion. So this could be through the type approval regulation that would restrict the worst performing tyres in respect of tread abrasion from the market. The second is to add tyre wear emissions to the existing EU tyre label. So that currently includes noise, efficiency, and wet grip. And we could add tyre wear abrasion to that label using the same A through G rating system that people are aware of and knowledgeable of, to allow consumers to make those informed decisions. We considered this is considered a demand side measure, so it would ensure that the consumers are adequately informed about the likely rate of tyre tread abrasion and therefore able to make decisions based on that information. The third is introducing EPR for tyre manufacturers with fee modulation specific to tyre abrasion. Whilst this is a potential additional mechanism, I think it's worth noting that the scale of the modulated fees are unlikely to be significant enough when compared with the overall cost of the tyre to cause any real market change. So these are our three policy measures that are being taken through to impact assessment. I think it's worth also noting quickly what impact this EU policy may have on the wider tyre market. And I imagine you'll have all heard of the Brussels effect, and we can talk quickly about what that might mean for tyres. So I think it's really important for if the EU were to implement these measures, it will be a lot easier for smaller countries with markets that have less influence over manufacturers to cause market change. Considering the size of the EU market, if this is implemented, manufacturers would likely consider the same standard and labels as well for all tyres across all of their production. Therefore, the information and the labels will be readily available for other smaller countries or markets to implement the same regulation and policies and standards. Finally, I've got one final slide. I just want to touch quickly on technology-based interventions as well. As we've discussed, some wear is unavoidable. Therefore, there's also a need to explore technologies that collect the particulate matter that is generated. So I've just highlighted three potential solutions here. So on the left, we have a drainage system that filters out microplastics when particulate matter is washed into drains following rain. This allows the microplastics to be captured before they enter the soils and the waterways. In the middle, we have a biofilter that uses natural interventions to kind of do the same thing. And on the right, we have a rather innovative device that is not commercially available at the moment, but it's pretty interesting, that's designed to be attached to your tyre to capture the tyre particles at source. It's fitted to the wheel and uses electrostatics to collect the particles as they're abraded. And it takes advantage of the airflows around the spinning wheel to do so. Quite a novel approach, but quite an interesting one. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hopefully taking any questions at the end of the session. I'm Lucy Eggleston. It's great to have this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. Yeah, that was impressive. That was impressive, and I think really interesting presentation. And yeah, I think you provide a lot of insights, not only on the problem of microplastic in the sea, but also on air quality. Maybe we are not very used to. I mean, the people in here, we are not so used to that, but it's very impressive. Here we have a question in the chat. It comes from Khadija, and actually you already provided some estimation of the release of tire per capita, but she's asking whether there is a kind of estimation from the release per tire, a single unit of tire.
It's a really good question. So it's dependent on so many factors that sort of data isn't currently available. There needs to be a really big study to that investigates that at a wider level. It depending on what car you drive and what tire you have on that car, you may have a thicker wall, a thicker tire wall, or thicker tread depth. That may mean that over a lifetime of a tire, you wear more, there's more microplastic created per that tire, but it will last longer. So what we really need is a value that is per kilometer, really, per tire. And that will allow us to identify the abrasion rate as opposed to just the amount of wear, full stop. With regards to a definitive number for microplastics released per tire, it is just too dependent on so many other factors for me to have access to a definitive number right now. But if that's something that you're interested in, then I'd really be open to having a bit of a conversation about that and talking about where the numbers might be and where you might be able to access some of that information.
Okay. Thank you. There is another question from Blivnat Goldberg that relates to collection, and I think maybe that it can be after last presentation, because on textiles it's also very important, the issue of collection. So maybe we can take that later. But if you may, I have another question, and it's in relation to the chemical additives to tires. I guess, I mean, I'm not an expert on that, but I guess like they have important chemicals to provide the properties, and maybe even like flame retardants and this kind of additives. So the performance is good for the tires, and also, well, yeah. So you mentioned this 6 ppd that was having like ecotoxicological effects. And so what are the properties of this chemical additive, and also whether you know some other additives that they are being used and they could be considered as chemicals of concern?
That is an excellent question. So 6 ppd itself, I believe it helps to bind the tire particulates together, but it's with the additives within tires, it can be really tricky because it's a bit of a toss-up between different areas of performance. And so when you consider the environmental performance of a tire, you can consider things like, okay, so yeah, wear rate that we've talked about, but toxicology, as you've suggested there, but also how efficient is it during use, how easy is it to recycle it at the end of life. So there's a balancing act that's needed to kind of realize all of these different factors. In terms of the toxicology of other additives, there are definitely others. I wouldn't want to start listing them now because I'm sure I will get an acronym wrong or something like that. But that's something that I can definitely revisit with you at a later date.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. We have 2 more questions. I think if we can go quickly on them, and then we can pass to the next speaker. So one from Lars, our next speaker. do we know if heavier and faster electric vehicles release more?
Yes.
That's one question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you can go for that, and
yeah,
then.
Sure. Okay. So yes, the weight of the vehicle has an impact on the rate at which tires wear. Up to about an increase of a 500 kilo payload. The relationship between tire wear and weight is pretty linear. So if you manage to reduce a vehicle's weight by 500 kilos, the tire wear abrasion rate is approximately 21% lower than if you don't manage to lightweight. So it's pretty significant. Electric vehicles do tend to be heavier because of the batteries, therefore their impact on wear rate is more significant. So that's a really interesting point you've raised actually, Lars, because we think of electric vehicles, a lot of people think of the electric vehicles as just kind of an amazing solution, and they're definitely a great part of a solution, but they're not without emissions and not without fault. So it's something that needs to be considered. And I think lightweighting of vehicles in order to counteract the additional weight that is added by the battery will be important to ensure that we're not having a net increase in tyre wear, particulate creation, as we switch over to electric vehicles. Faster vehicles as well do, vehicles operating at higher speeds do wear faster as well. But the mechanism that kind of encourages that is more to do with the acceleration than actually being at speed. So as you accelerate and decelerate quickly, you're going to wear more. So your tires are going to wear more. So if you're on a motorway, actually the wear rate of your tires isn't it's the acceleration that more rather than the maintaining the speed, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and last question from Algeria. I think that's an interesting one. Whether you know about the recycling of tire, like what kind of, information on recycling, and whether that might be an environmental issue as well.
Yeah, so tire recycling, as with many kind of products that are plastic in makeup, is broken down into a couple of different categories. So you do have mechanical recycling of tires, which is basically grinding, and those fine rubber crumb can be used for kind of downcycled applications, so things like sports fields and playgrounds and things like that, but can be incorporated at small levels into new tires. So you can have tires with a slight amount of recycled content, but the percentage of recycled tire particulate that you can include is very low. You run a risk of pretty significantly reducing the quality of the tire if you incorporate too high levels. There are other methods for recycling tires, for example, through pyrolysis and creating pyrolytic oil that can be then transformed back into other polymers and other materials, other products. But the yield of pyrolysis from tires is, again, pretty low. One of the most, a potentially good option for reducing the environmental impact of tires at end of life is manufacturing tires that can be retreaded or less so regrooved, but primarily retreaded. So retreading is when a tire is worn past the point of having enough tread to be safe for use anymore. You can bond an additional layer of rubber around the outside, and so you're building up that tread thickness again, so the tire can have essentially a second life. That does require virgin material to build up that tread, but as you can imagine, the material required to retread a tire is quite a lot lower than the material required to manufacture a complete new one. So that's a really good option for reducing end-of-life impacts of tires, but that does require certain considerations within the design phase of the actual tire, the design and manufacture. So they need to meet certain robustness requirements to be able to be retreaded. So you see a lot of truck tires and lorry tires being retreadable and retreaded, but less so with car tires.
Okay. Very good. So thanks a lot, Lucy. There was some other
You're
question.
welcome.
Maybe we have more time at the end of the webinar. So if you can stay, that would be lovely.
Cool.
Okay, so let's move to our next speaker. I would like to welcome Lars Mortensen from the European Environment Agency. So now we are going to switch to the textiles, another very interesting topic, I believe. So Lars, whenever you are ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pedro, and hi, everybody. I'm definitely ready, and I will now take you from the discussion of tires to the discussion of textiles. And one thing which is interesting is that actually tires are also partly made of textile fibers, and so it's very, very related. Let me just share with you some slides here. Just give me a second. Can you just confirm, Pedro, that you're seeing the slides?
Yeah, we can see perfectly.
Okay, thanks very much. So on to microplastic pollution from textiles, which is also very big, as you will see. So basically, just to start, I'm from the European Environment Agency. We are an EU institution, as many of you know, and our mandate is basically to monitor Europe's environment and climate, and this includes microplastics that we look at. I'm personally responsible for our work with textiles and plastics and consumption. And as you can see, many of our countries cover the Mediterranean, and we're looking at all of these many environment problems in this and other regions. I have 3 points to share with you today. One is that EU textiles consumption have on average the 4th largest environmental impacts, not only from microplastics, from other issues as well. And secondly, that the textiles is a major source of microplastics pollution, but there's also a lot of uncertainty around that. And then thirdly, that we have new EU policy on textiles and plastics, which aim to reduce microplastic emissions. So on my first point, let me just show you this slide, which is the global demand for fibers, fibers for textiles, but also including fibers for tires, actually. What you can see here is a development from 1940 to today, where we in the past used mainly cotton and wool, and the blue line here is the demand for synthetic fibers, so fibers made of plastics. And what you can see here is this is growing tremendously. So we've reached a point where the majority of our textiles are now made from synthetic fibers, which are made from plastics, which is made for oil and gas, which means a lot for its impacts on greenhouse gas emissions and for microplastics as well. In the next slide, I just wanted to show you where all these microfibers from textiles come from. So in the EU, we consume on average almost 15 kilograms of textiles per person. We consume 6 kilograms of clothing. This is what I'm showing in this virtual closet here. In blue, about 6 kilograms of household textiles, what I'm showing in yellow here, including bed linen, etc., and almost 3 kilograms of shoes. And this is, of course, what the relations to that causes the microplastic from textiles in the end. Before I move on to microplastics, I just wanted to show you one figure that actually illustrates that textiles have on average the 4th highest impacts from a consumption perspective on the environment. This shows this figure shows the use of primary raw materials for in the supply chain for consumption. And what you can see is that food on the top has the highest, and then comes housing, transport, furnishing, and in blue in the middle, textiles actually. Yeah? So for that, textiles is 5th biggest. For water use, it's 3rd biggest, and on average, it's actually 4th. And this is why textiles is so much more on the agenda now than it was just a few years ago. And that leads me to my second point, that textiles is a major source of microplastics pollution. We published recently a briefing on microplastic from textiles, and there was also an underpinning report looking at microplastic from textiles towards a circular economy for textiles in Europe. And some of the key messages that came out of there was that we referred to the studies that show that now over 14 million tons of microplastics have accumulated on the world's ocean floor. This is in line with what you've heard other speakers say as well. There there's a lot of uncertainty around all these numbers. I have to say this really clearly, because we see a lot of numbers from all sorts of places, and all numbers have a lot of uncertainty. We find that the number that about 8% of European microplastics released from oceans are from synthetic textiles, the most reliable at the moment, perhaps. Globally, the figure is estimated at 16 to 35%. But I bet that in a few years, these shares could be very, very different. I'm not so sure about all these shares that are shared outside about textiles and other sources. There's just so much uncertainty around it, and we've just studied it for a few years, actually. The third point here is that the majority of microplastics from textiles are released during washing, and actually during the first few times the textiles are washed. So the longer people have textiles, the less the microplastics releases are. And then the fourth point, that microplastics from textiles can be reduced by better design and production, better use and caretaking, and waste handling. And let me show you a few figures to illustrate some of these things. This one is quite similar to what you've seen before. This is our attempt to look at all the sources of microplastics in the environment. On the left, you see the sea-based sources, which was also discussed before. And on your right-hand side, you see the land-based resources. And this is where textiles come in, the wearing and washing of clothes, illustrated here just by the little truck, along with all the others. And this goes into the water, but into the air and into the soil as well. As you know, this has mostly been a discussion about microplastics in the marine environment, but microplastics, as explained, is equally an issue inland and in the air. Basically, this is a bit technical, but just to guide you through just on an overall basis. On the left here, you see this is basically about the release and fate of microplastic from textile soil. What actually happens? So what happens, as you can see on the left and the top, is you have the production of textile fibers. Then you have the use and the care of that. Wearing and washing the clothes leads microplastics into the wastewater treatment plants. This leads to effluents, and it leads to some microplastics being retained in the sludge, and this goes into the air, to the ocean, the fresh water, and the soil. At the same time, there is also microplastic coming from the littering of textiles as well directly. This is what you can see at the bottom of this figure. And one more figure showing kind of the end game of this, where we start here on the left. This is in blue, the air, the ocean, fresh water, and soil, which was the end of the previous figure. And then we look at exposure routes and hazard effects. So basically what happens here, you know, the human health impacts in purple here, you know, possible lung infections, inflammation, and the ecological impacts in green, including entanglement, reproductive toxicity, altered soil characteristics, and many more issues. And at the end, ultimately, we could have a decreased food consumption, growth, reproduction and survival in organisms, all kind of issues from this. So this is, of course, a big problem to them. Then what can we do about this? You know, the microplastic from textiles. So we've developed 3 pathways. So 3 ways forward. One is design and production on the left here. One is use and caretaking in the middle. I hear some noise coming actually. So somebody needs to mute their microphone. And on the right-hand side, disposal and end-of-life processing. So the first pathway. The first pathway in design and production, one thing that could be done was to use natural fibers instead of synthetic fibers. But then we would have not microplastics, but microfibers that are non-plastics, and this we know very little about. Could be alternative manufacturing processes. Could also be pre-washing at manufacturing plants where you have more control of the washing and the microplastics. Second, in the use and caretaking, you could have actually filters. You could put filters in the washing machines that could catch the microplastics. You could have different and milder detergents. You would have better washing guidelines. The last point is longer use of textiles, which is really, really important, because since most of the microplastics are released during the first few washes, then after that, there's very little microplastics coming out, at least in the washing, and also less in when wearing it. And then disposal end of life, you could have better textile waste management, proper wastewater treatment, and management of wastewater treatment sludge, and then ultimately cleanup of microplastics from the environment. But that's going to be really difficult, and this is a really end of pipe solution. So I think we should avoid having the microplastics ending there in the first place. This leads me to the third point, that the new EU policy on textiles and plastics, which aim to reduce microplastic emissions. This has also been mentioned before, but specifically on textiles. We had very recently in March, we had an EU textile strategy coming out from the Commission, saying what I've also shared here, that the consumption of textiles has on average the 4th highest impacts on environment and climate, and is in top 3 for water and land use, and top 5 in terms of raw materials and greenhouse gas emissions. And then the Commission has actually developed a vision for textiles, in which all products placed on the EU markets are durable, repairable, to a great extent made of recycled fibers, free of hazardous substances. The Commission has a vision that fast fashion should be out of fashion. So this is really, really ambitious to avoid fast fashion to the extent we can, and have much more high quality textiles, have more reuse and repair services, and that circular rather than throwaway clothes should become the norm. And in order to meet this vision, the Commission has proposed a large number of initiatives, and I will highlight two basically relate to microplastics. One is that the Commission says it will address the unintentional release of microplastics from textiles. They will do so in the revision of the Eco-Design Directive, which is currently being revised, where textiles will be included in that directive, so you can have requirements regarding microplastics. But also, as was mentioned earlier, the Commission has a communication on its way with proposals on microplastics overall to address tires, textiles, and other issues. And this is foreseen for Q4 this year, if I remember correctly, where we will see proposals. And the proposals we expect are in line, many of them with some of the pathways I told you about before. So it could be something around putting filters in washing machines, design requirements, etc. Below here are other elements of the textile strategy, but they're less crucial to the microplastics, even though some of them, the circular business models, etc., is also relevant. So is the extended producer responsibility, so that the producers take responsibility for their waste. And here are the other elements of the strategy. It's the Eco-Design Directive, digital product passport, tackling greenwashing, and then just avoid overproduction and overconsumption of textiles. One thing that is really important in this is that the Commission is considering a ban on destruction of unsold products or returned products. And this is important because this is a really large share, and this can also therefore be a big share of the microplastics. So that's one of I wanted to share with you on the microplastics from textiles. So I look forward to having a bit of time for discussion as well. Over to you, Pedro. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Lars. That was very informative and comprehensive. Again, very challenging source of microplastics. There was a comment in the chat. It was more like a funny comment, I would say, like we might need to get back to the prehistoric time if we want to preserve the environment. Maybe it's also like a general matter of consumption. I have a very specific question, and it's whether, I mean, the textile industry has been in the spotlight already for a while, not just for this, but also for use of chemicals and so on. Have they committed to have any voluntary initiative so they would address microplastics in a voluntary basis? So not for the legislation, but rather like, I don't know, whether they are having some kind of commitment and some action on that.
On the voluntary basis, I think the the EU communication, the strategy on textiles includes a lot of proposals for changes in legislation, but also some voluntary initiatives informing consumers, etc. But this is a complicated matter, and I would say that it's more about embedding textiles in EU regulation than other measures, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so maybe we can get one question. It was from Livnat, and she was asking about the collection. And I think she was referring more generally to the collection of plastic waste, but maybe we can speak a bit about the collection, and I would say the retention of microplastics. You were mentioning on the washing machines that there can be some filters that they can be installed. And maybe Lucy can also mention something about the retention, maybe in highways and this kind of infrastructure.
Maybe if I start and then Lucy can take over. I think the collection is, as I understand it, it can refer to collection of microplastics, but also it can refer to collection of waste in general, because if you collect and treat the waste better, then you can also avoid microplastics in that process. And I think from textiles, there could be a lot of potentials in collecting through filters, in washing machine, basically in production plants where you produce it, because, for example, a lot of jeans are pre-washed, and there you could actually collect the microplastics. Then you collect it again in the washing machines in the home, and then you can collect it again in the wastewater treatment plants where it comes out. So with that, I think you could collect quite a large proportion of the microplastic from textiles actually. And then there's an obligation in EU countries now to collect textiles waste, that all countries have to collect textile waste by 2025. And that means that by doing so, you can also avoid a lot of landfilling, illegal landfilling, where textiles are just lying around and also causing microplastics from lying around, in the weather. So I think that the whole waste management, better waste management, recycling will also help on that side.
Okay, thanks. I think there is a problem with interpretation in French, if my colleagues can deal with that. So if I may, just a question, Lars. So if, for example, if there is going to be like a higher collection of fibers from the waste, I mean, is there a plan to include that in the extended producer responsibility in textiles? I mean, would the producer pay for the infrastructure to collect those fibers? Or they would participate in the collection, I mean, in the covering those costs?
That is a possibility. The proposal is only out there, and to my extent, microplastics is actually a next step on the textiles. So I would not expect that to be included in the short term, actually, even though it could be a good idea. The treatment plants, it's a complicated issue to have more filters there, and a very expensive one. So I don't know. To be seen. I think some of the measures will be. I think the extended producer responsibility will be developed over time in a few years, and we have to consider all these issues and see what we can include, I would say.
Okay, thank you. So Lucy, if you want to say anything on the retention technologies of tire wear.
Yeah, sure. So I touched on a couple at the end of the presentation of drain filters and things like that, which are definitely show promise, but they do require really widespread implementation to be able to be effective. There are lots and lots of roads, and tire wear occurs evenly across them. There are definitely spots where there are greater levels of particulate matter found, again to do with sort of cornering and accelerating and braking and things. But in order for this to be effective, you need quite significant coverage of drain filters and things like plastics. Some of those novel technologies, such as the tire vacuum that I showed you as well on that slide, there's potential there, but again, you'd need to ensure that they were on every single tire. Par l'intermédiaire de ces filtres, on pourrait arrêter, intercepter une grande. I think the priority here should be understanding what the minimum level of tire wear is to ensure safe use, and then encouraging producers or manufacturers to design and manufacture tires with that in mind, so that our consumers can make decisions based off of tire wear abrasion rates, and actively choose tires that wear less so that they can minimize.
Donc, produire des pneus qui ne présentent pas des grands.
Okay, very good. I don't see any more specific question. There are some comments in the chat, but no specific question. If someone wants to take the floor and just ask loudly the question, that's also possible. You feel for that. Otherwise, we might move forward and go to the evaluation, or if anyone wants to comment anything on this webinar or also on the previous one, that also welcome at this time. No? So okay, so let's move forward to the evaluation of the webinars. For that, I would like to give the floor to Emad from the WES team. He's the expert on that, on the stakeholders engagement. So Emad, if you are ready. And thanks, Lars and Lucy. It was a pleasure having you here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it was great.
So Emad, Anis, Marta, I think you are taking over now.
Yes, sorry.
Ahmed, I think.
Yes, Ahmed was supposed to take over. So. Otherwise, let me just see if he's connected. Yes.
Yeah, Marta, I may suggest if he's not available at the moment, yes, you may start and then he may step in and that's it. But I think you can start with the evaluation.
Hello? No, I'm here.
Là, je suis là. Je suis ici. Pardon, Emad, j'avais pensé que nous t'avions perdu. Merci, Pedro. J'aimerais
introduce here the issue of the evaluation because it's very important that, we have already, this is the third module that participants have attended. And the whole idea of having participated in this process was definitely to get more knowledge and get experience on the issue, which is very much, I would say, an emergency in the region. The second thing is that we have to think about how we are going to move forward in the sense of at the personal level, at the institutional level, and also at the country, at the regional level. So this is why, and then of course, we have to see the impacts of what we are talking about. And because if we have modules and we have training and then we stay at this point and we don't move forward, this means that we are still business as usual. So the whole idea of my intervention here is to talk to our participants and to tell them that the reason for having you and the reason for having us here and the team that have prepared this wonderful modules is to make an impact and to make a difference. And we should not come in next end of the year or next year and we find that things are still the same. So based on that, please look at the evaluation. And while you are, especially in the last part of the evaluation, think about what you can do as a next step from now. What happens that because I am in charge of the impact assessment and the stakeholder engagement in this process, and this WES process or WES project, we are always keen to see and to measure how our support to the countries made a difference for the countries, for the institutions, for the individuals. So this is why I would like them, every one of you, to look at the questions and try to put something that we can measure in the future. And we will come back to you and maybe a few weeks, and then maybe later before the end of the WES project next year, we will come back to you 2 times at least to see how far you were able to make the use of the training and experience that you have gained through this. I know you have questions about, and the evaluation about how you found the presentations, how you found the moderation, how you found the information, how you found, everything. But I would really like to see how we can expect from you, from yourself, from your organizations, from your work together at the national level, how we are going to make a difference that will show an impact that has happened due to our involvement in the 3 modules. I stop here, Pedro, and thank you very much, Marta, for giving me also the chance to say something and also to refresh the memories of our participants about their commitment forms and how they are going to move forward with the knowledge they have gained. Back to you, Pedro. Thank you.
Thank you, Anis. Thank you, Imad. Sorry. Actually, as Imad mentioned, we are now suggesting you kindly go to the following link that was posted in the chat. You have it here also in the screen. Can you all see well the full screen? Yes, I can see it. Okay. So if you can please go to this link that was posted in the chat, you will have, I would say, we can
Marta,
have
we don't see
minutes.
the full screen. If you can
you don't
share this. Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
It's not in presentation mode.
Well, let's see if this time, sorry. Anyway, in the meantime, you can open your browsers and we kindly invite you to start looking at it. We will have 10 minutes. You will have 10 minutes for this. We actually will activate a timer so you can keep track of it. And as mentioned by Imad, it's very important for us, your contribution. So let's see now. No, it's not on full screen. No,
Marta, can I, sorry to interrupt, Marta. Anyway, I will put the timer. Should I just start the timer and in the mean or no?
Well, I just want, yes, it's fine. You can put the timer. That's not that important that they see the link as they have it already. So thank you very much, Magda. You can put the timer. We will come back in 10 minutes.
Okay.
Please do not leave the Zoom meeting. And as mentioned by Imad, we really hope you can contribute with your responses to improve these trainings. And the evaluation you will see, it consists of the 3 modules. So please take in mind bear in mind when you completed the 3 modules. Thank you. Any difficulties, please use the chat to contact us in case the link is not opening or you have any questions regarding the evaluation or what you're supposed to do.
I see, Marta, someone is saying that the link is not open.
Thank you, Matt. I was posting another version of it.
I saw you are sending another link. Yes, thank you, Marta. Maybe the link has to be copied and then they open a new browser and put it. Maybe this would be a solution.
C'est quoi le problème que vous trouvez? C'est avec...
What is exactly the problem that you have? Is it with the link that we have shared on chat? Is that your problem?
Monsieur Ben Haddouche, vous pouvez utiliser le lien directement sur la discussion, le chat.
You can use the link directly.
Cliquez sur le lien à droite au niveau du chat.
Click on the link that you have on chat.
Thank you, Anis, for highlighting this. Of course, I would like to remind all our participants that during the process of applying for the training, that we asked for a kind of commitment form to be filled by all the participants. The whole idea of the commitment is not something that it's going to be, something that we use legally against anyone. It's just a kind of, showing how far every one of us is willing to support the change that we need to do when it comes to microplastics and so on. This is also the time while you are doing writing what you want to say and the evaluation. You may change your idea because now maybe before you started, you were thinking about, before you start, you get into the training, your ideas were maybe different, and definitely they were, less than what you have now. So you have now also the time that you can add or change of what you have written in your commitment form. But definitely, we would like to see some improvement happening. We would like to see something happening at the individual level of every one of you, at the institutional level, and also at the country and regional level, as I said. So think about how you can develop your work at yourself, how you are going to work with your colleagues in your institution and with your boss, with your line managers, on how to make things different, how you are going to work with other partners. If you are in a government, how you are going to do this with the NGOs, or how you are going to do this with academia, or you are government and you look at the other partners, how you can also work with them on something, how you can work with this with, for example, legislators, how you can do this with media. So there are many ideas that you can think about to make the impact getting bigger and larger, and also meaningful. Because at the end of the day, we would like to see this issue is taken seriously by the different institutions, because the Mediterranean is really suffering from the issue, and it's one of the it's actually the hottest spot when it comes to the amounts and the magnitude of the problem. So these are the ideas that I'm putting in front of you so you can think, in a more artistic and more also innovative way to deal with the topic and to make things different. I'm already there. I will put in the chat my email if any one of you would like to have to contact me later and to see how we can help or change ideas on the topic. I will be very happy to do this and continue the discussion, because for sure we will be back to you later, as I said, with more questions and discussions, maybe through a survey or through telephone calls or whatever. But as I said, this is my this is our email, and I would appreciate very much if anyone has a question later or anything to discuss, also about ideas how you can make the impact much bigger and much influential. We are ready to support and to help as much as we can. I hope this was helpful, and again, thanks to Marta, Pedro, Anis for all our non-key experts and key experts for the work they have done. And thanks to our participants, because without the participants, we are not going to make any difference. The difference will happen when all our participants are joining hands with us, and we are doing something for the topic and for our countries and our region. Thank you very much. Back to you, Marta.
Thank you, Emad. Thank you very much. I see there is a raised hand, Khalil. Is this regarding, well, do you have a question, or this was a mistake?
No. Thank you very much. Okay. If you allow, I would like to add something. I am Khalil from Palestine. I am an employee in Palestinian Environmental Quality Authority in Palestine. I am following chemical hazardous waste in Gaza. Actually, I am facing some difficulties to attend those 3 training courses, or actually I have attended the first one and last the middle one I couldn't attend because there is a shortage in electricity in Gaza, as all you know. But as a whole, I am gain so much knowledge, informations. Those are valuable information I had gained during those courses. I am participate in it, but actually I think it is hard to implement such kind of orientation or such kind of things to do to minimize microplastic, especially in Gaza or in low-income country like us in Gaza, because there is no rules, no bylaws, no regulations, no monitoring. So I think we will face some difficulties to mitigate or decrease microplastic waste in environment. Environment as a whole. Also, we are in Gaza face so much difficulties because our wastewater treatment is not so efficient. So I think that our wastewater treatment just treated half of waste and the other half is follow to the sea. So we are we become part of pollutants in this area. Of course, it is due to siege, due to political reasons, due to short of funders or supporters to Palestinian people. So those kind of words I am just want you to know this, and thank you very much. Also, I would like to add that field experiments also I think I am personally couldn't implement it there in Gaza, and I think what I am couldn't perhaps my colleague also in other country couldn't, because these kind of experiments need to practice on the ground and the time is not enough for us to get all process how to deal if we need to experiment that if there is microchips or microplastic on the beach or on the sand or even in the water. Thank you very much.
Indeed, thank you very much for sharing your experience. Indeed, you have an extra challenge there, and we wish you the best. And however we could help by providing publications or access to other trainings, feel free to contact us, and we will see how we can support you further. Thank you very much, Khalil. I will proceed now with a very short wrap-up of the series of modules that we've been conducting for the past 2 months. Pedro, I'm not sure if you could share, otherwise it's I can just continue. So thank you very much. I present very briefly myself. You haven't seen me. Some of you know me. I work at MedWaves as a project manager of the WES, so I'm more in the backside, and I'm just taking this opportunity for to conduct the wrap-up just before you go. And I thank you for your active participation, and I also thank all the experts that share their knowledge with us. So as a short wrap-up, as I was saying, you can move to the next slide. Thank you, Pedro. Of this series of 3 modules that we've had, the first module that took place in mid-May actually addressed the issue mainly of the definition, how difficult it is to come up with one definition, and that how that affects also in conducting further actions, and also the issue of monitoring and classification of the plastics. Mainly some of the messages that we could take away from that session was the importance of size to determine the possible different impacts, and also the question that basic toxicological data on the consumption of micro and nanoplastics by humans is still lacks assessment, and we lack information on that. Also that microplastics greatly outnumber large plastic items in marine systems. You can please move to the next one. Actually, as during the webinar 1, we addressed also the difference on primary microplastics and secondary microplastics. Also, this was a division that we have seen how there is intentionally and microplastics and secondary microplastics that will come from fragmentation or degradation, which for webinar 2, on the next slide, we see that we addressed the primary microplastics, so mainly pellet loss and the intentionally added microplastics in products. We had also very key speakers and sessions. We saw how at the different political frameworks that address microplastics at 3 levels, so the global, the regional, and the EU level, that serve us as a basis as well for us as policy makers and public authorities to use. As well, we saw how what can be done from the individual point of view and as organizations. Also, the message that it's a chronic and structural pollution came across during this session. The importance that pellet pollution affects the whole value chain, and that regulations should actually require to address the entire value chain, and mainly the ones that are putting those plastics forward. So the industry, we also had an interesting presentation from the cosmetics industry. If you can move to the next one, please, Pedro. The final one, today's session was addressed the unintentional release microplastics. You have it very fresh, so I will not go into the details, but mainly we saw how from one side we have the textiles pollution and the tires pollution, which most of us or many of us are not that aware. We also looked at the sources, the pathways, the types, and measures and guidelines that we can apply mainly to prevent. So the question of prevention. It's very difficult, as you have seen, to address, as you have expressed, to address radical measures on stopping this kind of secondary pollution from microplastics. And yeah, I would say one of the key messages we could take away also is that plastic particles, tire plastic particles, are also in the air and can penetrate the lungs and bloodstream. And that textiles, this was also seen in the first module, is one of the major sources of microplastic pollution. Thank you very much. I pass the floor to Anis Ismail, who is the WES environmental expert. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Marta, for reminding us of the takeaway messages and key figures. Please know that yes, the training material is uploaded on the WES project website, medwaves.eu. So I personally believe that these 3 sessions were very informative and interesting, with lots of information, figures, and facts. And I noticed that we did not lose participants during the course of the modules, and that is indeed a good indicator. Dr. Ahmed from WES team will get in touch with you and assess impact and follow-up actions. So on behalf of the WES team, I hope this regional training was also interesting for you too. May I recall that this topic originated from a request emanating from the Barcelona Convention focal points that expressed their wish to understand better the emerging issues of microplastics and which kind of actions should be shaped to address it. At the same time, tackling pollution from plastics and marine litter, including microplastics, is also the core of the UFM's 2030 Greener Med agenda and indeed of the latest UN resolution on plastics. It is widely acknowledged that the Mediterranean Sea is one of the most affected seas by marine litter worldwide. So we hope that we contributed through these 3 modules under WES regional activities improving the knowledge of participants on the threat that microplastics pose on the environment and human livelihood, and to support the WES partner countries in engaging further with regional and national plans to address the issue of microplastics. Now it's your turn to raise awareness among policy and decision makers on this topic and to contribute in guiding, designing, and implementing national and regional programs and actions to reduce and eventually phase out the use of primary microplastics and prevent the leakage of plastic litter into the environment. Yes, to make an impact, as mentioned by Ahmed. I know, Khalil, these actions are challenging, especially in the actual context, but yes, let's try to move forward together. I would like to remind you that WES is implementing a number of activities and at regional, sub-regional, and national levels. In the Mediterranean region, WES is also launching a new series of activities as a contribution to the regional and national efforts for the reduction of impacts related to plastic pollution, and also to support designing new policies, applying economic, technical alternatives on the topics like EPR, extended producer responsibility for plastic sector, green banking applied to municipal waste and plastic sectors, policy guidance to ban plastic polymers, separate collection and plastic waste recycling, regulatory and technical measures for reduction and gradual elimination of single-use plastic, and of course, a number of activities on public awareness and communication. These activities are implemented in close coordination and synergy with other partners and institutions, including, of course, MedWaves, our consortium partner. And I take this opportunity to thank once again the team from MedWaves, MIO teams, and other guests and speakers and interpreters and technical team and backstoppers for the support in preparing this course. I would like to thank all of you, peers and participants, for your interest and for your active participation in these webinars. So I look forward to seeing you in our next activities. Thanks again for your presence. Thank you. Thank you, Marta, and pass the floor to you. And
I pass it to Pedro. Maybe he wants to propose a final picture, or
yes.
He was one of the key players in during this training, actually. So he's the main.
Yes, as you like. Well, I would also like to join Anis in thanking everyone. Merci à tous de votre participation. And if you want to switch on your camera and we can take a family picture, that would be great. Yeah, as a closing thing for the webinar. So we are getting some faces. Okay, so a big smile. Okay, so thanks a lot and take care of yourself and of the environment. And I hope to see you very soon in some other occasion. Take care.
Thank you. Merci. Shukran.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Shukran, Anis. Thank you.
Pedro.
Thank you. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Shukran.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for everything.
Thank you very much for everyone.